Okay, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Nurul Syafika. Here I want to explain about sampling. Sampling, the quality of a study does not only stand or fall by the accuracy of the methodology and instrumentation, but also by the suitability of the sampling strategy that has been adopted. And the question of example arises directly from the problem of defining the population in which the research will focus. Researchers must make early discussion in planning the overall study. More important for researchers is the need to think in advance of collecting data on the type of relationship they wish to explore within the subgroups of their final sample. The number of variables the researcher assign to control for their analysis and the type of statistical test they wish to perform should inform their discussion about sample size prior the actual study. And the next explanation is about the sample size. The sample size, a question that often plagues novice researchers, is just how large their samples for the research should be. There is no clear but answer. The correct sample size depends on the purpose of the study and the nature of the population under scrutiny. However, it is possible to give some advance on this matter. Thus, a sample size of 30 is held by many to be the minimum number of cases. Each researchers plan to use some form of statistical analysis in their data. And next, of more import to researchers is need to think out in advance of many data collection. And the sort of relationship that they wish to explore within subgroups of their eventual sample. The number of variables researchers set out the control in their analysis and the type of statistical test that they wish to make must inform their decisions about sample size prior the actual research undertaking. And the next explanation is with both qualitative and quantitative data. An essential requirement is that the sample is representative of the population from which it is drawn. Here, the qualitative data. In a qualitative study of 30 high-able girls of similar socioeconomic background following on a level biology course, a sample of 5 or 6 may suffice the researchers who is prepared to obtain additional corroborative data by way of validation. And where there is heterogeneity in the population, then a large sample must be selected on some base that respect that heterogeneity. And teacher definitely by gender, age, subject, spatially management, or classroom responsibility. It would be insufficient to contract a sample consisting of 10 female classroom teacher of arts and humanities subject. And the next is about quantitative data. For quantitative data, a price sample number can be calculated according to the level of accuracy and the level of probability that the researchers cries in her work. She can then report in her study and relationally and the basis of her research decision. Okay, maybe just it from my explanation, and the next will be explained by my friend Indahayatul Karomah.
The next explanation will be delivered by me, that is about sampling error. Sampling error is often taken to be the difference between the sample mean and the population mean. Sampling error is not necessarily the result of mistakes made in sampling procedures. Rather, variations may occur due to the chance selection of different individuals. For example, if we take a large number of samples from the population and measure the mean value of each sample, then the sample means will not be identical. Some will be relatively high and some will relatively low, and many will cluster around an average or mean value of the samples. And honestly, there is a formula to measure the sampling error. Next is the standard error of proportion. We said earlier that one answer to how big a sample must I obtain is how accurate do I want my results to be. A simple calculation of the standard error of proportions provides on the slide. There is a formula of standard error of proportions. P is the percentage in favor, Q is 100% minus P, and N is the sample size. Next is the representativeness of the sample. The researcher will need to consider the extent to which it is important that the sample in fact represents the whole population in question, and the researcher will need to be clear what it is that is being represented. These 4 variables, climate, age group, occupation, and reported incidents were seen to exert a disproportionate effect on the study. If the study were to have been carried out in an area where the climate, age group, occupation, and reporting were to have been different, then the results might have been different. And the next is about the access to the sample. Researchers will need to answer not only that access is permitted, but is in fact practicable. In some sensitive areas, access to a sample might be denied by the potential sample participants themselves. For example, an AIDS counselor. And then access may also be denied by the potential sample participants themselves for very practical reasons. For example, a doctor or a teacher's employee might not have the time to spend with the researcher. Further, access might be denied by people who have something to protect. Next is the sampling strategy to be used. The researcher must decide whether to offer a probability, also known as a random sample, or a non-probability sample, also known as a purposive sample. The difference between them is this: in a probability sample, the chance of members of the wider population being selected from the sample are known, whereas in non-probability sample, the chance of members of the wider population being selected from the sample are unknown.
Okay, my name is Lurjatul Muliso. Here I'm gonna explain about first simple random sampling. A simple random sampling probability sample in which every member of a study population has an equal chance of selection. Simple random sampling means each member of the population under the study has an equal chance to be selected. In this case, each individual is chosen. Essential to get a random sampling is to assign a number of each individual in a population and then use a random number table to decide which individual to include. For example, like lottery. When this simple random sampling is used, there is some advantages and disadvantages. Some advantages among minimal knowledge of population need and easy to analyze the data, and some disadvantage among low frequency of the use and large risk of random error. Okay, the second is systematic sampling. The first element is selected randomly from a list from sequential files, and then nodes element is selected. Individuals are selected at regular interval from the sample frame. The intervals are chosen to ensure an adequate sample size. If you need a sample size and from a population of size X, you should select every X and N individual for the sample. Systematic sampling is often more efficient than simple random sampling, and it is very easy to administer. Okay, the third is stratified sampling. Stratified sampling, a probability sampling process that involves dividing the population in group of strata defined by the presence of certain characteristics, and then random sampling from each stratum. In this case, the population is first divided into subgroup or strata who all share a similar characteristic. It is used when we make reasonably accept the measurement of interest to vary between the different subgroup, and we want to ensure a representation from all the subgroup. The study sample is then obtained by taking equal sample size from each stratum. In stratified sampling, it may also be appropriate to choose non-equal sample size from each stratum. Okay, the fourth is cluster sampling, a probability sampling process that involves randomly selecting cluster of elements from a population and subsequently selecting every member in each selected cluster for inclusion in the sample. In a clustered sample, subgroup of the population are used as the sampling unit rather than individual. The population is divided into subgroups known as clusters, which are randomly selected to be included in the study. Clusters are usually already defined. In single-stage cluster sampling, all members of the chosen cluster are then included in the study. In two-stage cluster sampling, a selection of the individual from each cluster is then randomly selected for inclusion. Clusters should be taken into account in the analysis. Cluster sampling can be more efficient than simple random sampling, especially where a study takes place over one geographical region. Okay, the fifth is stage sampling. Stage sampling is an extension of cluster sampling. It involves selecting the sample in stage, that is taking a sample from sample that is using large community. For example, in cluster sampling, one type of stage sampling may be to selected number of schools at random, and from within each of these schools selected number of classes at random, and from within those classes selected number of students. Okay, the sixth is multi-praise sampling. In multi-praise sample, the purpose of chance at each pair. In stage sampling, there is a single unifying purpose to the sampling. In the previous example, the purpose was to reach a particular group of students from particular region. In a multi-praise sample, the purpose changes at each praise. Okay, non-probability sampling. Non-probability sampling involves non-random selection based on coefficients. Okay, non-probability sampling is divided into 5 sampling. The first is coefficient sampling. Coefficient sampling is known as accidental and opportunity sampling that involves selected sample based on coefficients. Coefficient sampling is perhaps the easiest method of the sampling because the participants are selected based on availability and willingness to take part. Useful results can be obtained, but the results are prone to significant bias because those who volunteer to take part may be different from those who choose not to volunteer bias, and the sample may not be representative of other characteristics. And the second is quota sampling. Quota sampling means to take a very tailored sample that's in proportion to some characteristic or trait of a population. This method of sampling is often used by market researchers. Interviewers are given a quota of subjects of a specified type to attempt to recruit. The researcher wishing to define a quota sample can be produced in 3 stages. The first is identify those characteristics or factors which appear in the wider population which must also appear in the sample. And the second stage is identify the proportion in which the selection characteristics appear in the wide population expressed as a percentage. Okay, the third stage is to ensure that the percentage proportion of the characteristics selected from the wider population appear in the sample. Okay, the third is purposive sampling. Purposive sampling is selecting sample based on his or her own judgment, also known as selective or subjective sampling. This technique relies on the judgment of the researcher when choosing who to ask to participate. Researchers may implicitly thus choose a representative sample to suit their need or specifically approach an individual with certain characteristics. This approach is often used by the media when convincing the public for opinion and in qualitative research. Judgment sampling has the advantage of being time and cost effective to perform with least resulting in range responses, particularly useful in qualitative research. Okay, the fourth is dimensional sampling. One way of reducing the problem of sample size in a quota sampling is to opt for dimensional sampling. Dimensional sampling is further refinement of quota sampling is involved identifying various factors of interest in a population and obtaining at least one respondent of every combination of those factors. Okay, the fifth is snowball sampling. In snowball sampling, researchers identify a small number of individuals who have the characteristic in which they are interested. These people are then use a format to identify or put the researcher in touch with others who qualify for inclusion of this in term identify chat other hashtag the term snowball sampling. This method is commonly used in social sciences when investigating hard to reach group. Existing subjects are asked to nominate further subjects known to them, so the sample increases in size like a rolling snowball. Okay, that's all from the explanation from our group, and the last we say thank you.